Hi, welcome to Office Hours. I'm glad you're all here, and everyone who's listening to this on recording, I'm glad you're listening to it now. So welcome. I'm going to start off with the first guest question that I have, and then I'm going to go into the filed questions. I have a lot of questions this evening, so I'm going to be quick and focused, hopefully. I'm also pretty tired, but I'm going to try and get through that. So guest 6982 says, hello, Emily. Can you address collections of linked stories in terms of marketability? Secondly, novels with ensemble casts in terms of marketability. So first, collections of linked short stories are marketable, but they are marketable the same way all short story collections are marketable, which means that they're not as easy to sell as novels. And I think this might be more important, is that you really have to get at least 2 to 3, but maybe even more of that, of the short story collection published in literary journals or magazines. The higher profile, the better, before you start submitting to publishers. Publishers don't take poetry collections or short story collections seriously in any way unless at least 1/4 of them, approximately, this isn't a hard or fast rule, have been published before in literary journals. And some literary journals make all the difference, and others, don't really make a difference. A friend of mine had, I think, 8 short stories published, and they couldn't get this short story collection published at all as a whole. And then one of those stories was picked up by the New Yorker, and it actually became a really great audio short story. Tim Curry did the voice for it too. But the point of it is that the minute the New Yorker signed it, he got like some sort of video deal, and suddenly he had a signed contract for the entire book. So linked short stories are not that marketable because people approach them the same way they would an unlinked short story collection. And because you have to start submitting to literary journals first. Like, that is so important before you start submitting to literary agents, because they will not take you seriously without that. I know some people have like one short story published, their literary agent finds them through that short story, and then they go on to like the literary journal. The literary agent actually sends them out to journals and magazines that way. And then they start submitting to books. Like, that's how that process usually works. If you're going the literary agent route, some literary publishers of short stories allow direct submissions, but they still expect some of those stories to be published previously. I hope that answers the first part of your question. Secondly, novels with ensemble casts are much easier to market, and they do really well. Sometimes it depends. Like, it really helps if there's like some sort of linchpin or key or twist that sort of plays on it. I'm reading an ensemble cast book right now. I think it's called The 7 Lives of, wait, I can see it. The 7 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle. But it's sort of an untraditional one. And there's lots of other ensemble like pieces that have come out within the last couple of years that have been debuts. That's a debut. And so it's much easier to do because it's actually much easier to sell a manuscript that's a novel versus short story collections in general. And because there is definitely a market for ensembles. So I think that answers that question. Okay, so on to the other questions. Susie Hale asked a really nice detailed question. I'm actually going to repeat it verbatim. So she said, and this is Susie, not me, I'd like to know what you think about all the online MFA creative writing programs. I'm a retired teacher in my 60s. I've long considered attempting to apply and complete an MFA with a concentration in poetry or creative nonfiction. However, time, cost, and travel have derailed my efforts. But now I'm beginning to notice that there are more and more opportunities to earn this degree online, and the costs seem less prohibitive. For instance, Linwood in Missouri offers a 2-year program for around $23,000. I don't need another degree. I'm more interested in learning. I've taken many online writing classes and have enjoyed them immensely, but there is never a sense of cohesiveness. I think that's a really good point. We used to call this scope and sequence early in my teaching career. Are you familiar with any online MFA programs or other creative writing programs that offer a complete program? Do you think that this would be a worthwhile endeavor, and what criteria should I consider using when I do research? What markers indicate a good choice? So first of all, I don't know that much about the new online MFA programs. And I'm also, for someone who has one, a little skeptical of the MFA in general. I mean, I'm really glad that I got mine from Sarah Lawrence, and I'm really glad I attended that program, and the mentors I worked with there were incredible. And I met some great lifelong friends, but I never got a cohesive program at all at Sarah Lawrence. And I know Columbia's approach, which was the other school I got into, is supposed to be more cohesive and more sort of like the scope and sequence. They get that. But the problem with Columbia is apparently is that they have this very specific idea of where you should be as a writer in terms of if you write really great small poems, for example, they don't just want that. They want so whatever you go in with, they want you to come out with more range. And that in theory is good. But in practice, most of the poets that came out of there sounded a little similar. So that's why I chose Sarah Lawrence. But anyways, I don't think an MFA is necessary in general, because I think it tends to be a really piecemeal program, and it really depends on where you take it. I do know that there is an exception to this rule. It's not an online program, though. I have heard a lot, and I've met a lot of graduates from the Warren Wilson program. Tom Lux, one of my mentors, was really instrumental in starting it, and he's passed away now. But it is supposed to be an incredible sort of cohesive approach to writing, and the writers that I've met that have come out of there are incredible. It's not cheap, and I don't know if there's like a scholarship that you would be able to get there or not, but it's also like one of the problems with a lot of the MFA programs, but maybe not with the online MFA programs, is they sort of they prefer younger students. And so Sarah Lawrence was one of the exceptions to this, but I knew a lot of like really talented older writers who weren't getting into these programs just because of their age. And so I think Warren Wilson is not like that at all. A lot of the people going into the programs are in their 40s and their 50s and their 60s. So you really have this different sort of range and approach, and you really have this cohesiveness. But if you really want to keep pursuing this online MFA program, because you probably will learn great things with it, and if it's financially like feasible and reasonable, what I would really look at is faculty. And I would look at the rate your teacher reviews, and not just if you love their writing. One of my favorite writers of all times was a teacher at Sarah Lawrence. And I quit her class after 2 sessions because she said her goal was to make every single student cry. And that was the way we were going to become better poets. And I was just like, no, thank you. And from what I heard afterwards, I'm really glad I quit when I did. So I would really look at both their work, how well known they are, and what the rate your professors say, because I think that is an important consideration. And the great thing about most people who are teaching at MFA programs, even if that MFA program is probably brand new, they probably taught elsewhere, and you can find information online about them, even if it's not for that school. So I would definitely keep that in mind if you proceed down this route. And so I would say take one if you really want one, if you think it will really help. Do I think it will be different necessarily than doing this piecemeal on your own? Not exactly. My husband did his undergrad at Western Washington University, and he did his degree in creative writing. My undergrad isn't in that. And he learned about as much as I did at my MFA program. The only real difference was like the access to professors and the concentration on the thesis, which was very helpful for me. I hope I answered that, because we are going to move on to the next question, which is, oh, and always feel free, if I never answer your question as thoroughly as you want, to send me an email and I'll send you even more feedback then. So Joanna asks, if the agency advises sending to the agent that you feel is best for your work, and there are two that might fit the bill, would you send it to the more senior agent? I wouldn't necessarily. Usually, if you're looking at an agency, there aren't two that are exactly the same. One is slightly better than the other, or you feel slightly more connected to like more of the authors they represent, or more of the things they list as their favorite preferences. I would go with that one. I actually think that you'd have better luck with the less senior agent because they're more open to debuts because they're still making their careers. And that's something I keep in mind when I'm giving advice. I try to recommend sometimes less senior agents at an agency because of this. They are much more likely to take a risk on someone who isn't established. And there's all sorts of levels of established, like even for unpublished authors. Like you could be an unpublished author and still have been published by, unpublished in terms of manuscripts, and still be published by the New Yorker, or, attended a bunch of very prestigious fellowships on conferences on fellowship, all these things that look great on the resume. And you, with your manuscript and maybe not that level of prestige, you're against those people. And so you have to keep that in mind. And I do think that the newer agents tend to be more flexible, the less senior ones, and more willing to take risks because the reward is greater. The second question from Joanne is, again, if there are several agents in the agency and 3 or 4 might be appropriate, should you pick one out of a hat or send to more than one at the same agency? So if the agency is open to you sending to more than one agent at that agency, they will explicitly say that, in my experience. Otherwise, they are assuming that you are only submitting to one agent. And the way most agencies work is if that agent reads your work and they know it isn't for them, but they really like it, and they know of another agent at that agency that can represent it, they'll pass it on. All the agents I've met in person, that's how their agencies functioned. I know that's not how all agencies function because they said that, but it's how a lot of them do. So it is kind of rude for that reason to submit to more than one at the same agency. So I would just submit to the one that really seems to be the best fit. Suzanne asks, if it is time to follow up with an inquiry regarding the status of one's submission to a literary journal or a publisher, is there a recommended language to use or to avoid? I just be polite, be thoughtful. Don't say, hey, you've had this for a really long time, get back to me now. That's rude. Just be considerate and behave in the way you would in a business interaction. Usually I say, I'm sorry to bother you. I know that you're busy. I just wanted to check up on the status of my manuscript. List the name always, or the name of your poems. And then you can say, I submitted them. You can list that too. And then you could say, I look forward to hearing back from you. That's it. That sort of response, like formal, to the point, polite. That's what I would stick to. And Suzanne's second question is, when submitting poems to journals that have not stated a specific theme, is it better to send a diverse group of poems or to submit poems focused around a singular theme? Always submit diverse poems. I've long felt that. And every editor I've talked to, from the editor of Menacing Hedge to the editor of Poetry Magazine, the whole range, has said that they much prefer to see a range. Unless they're themed, they want to see sort of what you're capable of. And sometimes, I know this happens with poetry and with Poetry Northwest, if they really love one of the poems, but is not quite right, they'll say, hey, we really love this poem. Could you send us more like that? So that does happen. And that has happened to me at various literary journals. So definitely send a range unless they specify that they're just looking for a theme. Okay. Joanne asks, I'm hoping you can advise me in regards to the next step of my manuscript, Birthday Girls. I've gone through it and done some more editing. I circulated it a few years ago and had an agent pick it up, but then mysteriously she dropped out of the contract. That's really not unheard of. It's unfortunately pretty common. I had another agent really interested, but then she said she didn't have the energy to try and sell a multi-voice book. I have given up on it, but recently I thought maybe it's time to try again. And then Mario asks, what are some signals that your manuscript isn't going to be picked up by an agent and or publisher, and it's time to either revise severely or go on to another project? Is there an amount of time, months, years, that might be too long to keep trying? So I read both these questions together for probably an obvious reason. They have a lot of overlap. And they're kind of about the same issue. And I think it's a really good question. And I think it's a question almost all authors ask themselves. And I think it's really great to hear stories like about Madeline Longlongla. I never know how to pronounce her last name. And A Wrinkle in Time, which got rejected basically from every children's book publisher in New York. And she just kept persisting. And then it won, the Newbery, all the awards, and we're still reading it. And she's far from the only author with that sort of backstory. But we also, like, for our own sanity's sake, have to move on at a certain point. And so for me, what I would do is put a strict deadline on a calendar, because those are the sort of things that you stick with. And then put your all into it before that deadline passes. And then after that deadline passes, if it's a year, if it's 6 months, then move on to something new. And I do think it's really important, no matter how literary you are, to consider self-publishing. I've had people with a lot of success with that. As long as you're not working with a vanity press, as long as you're in control of the things, I think there's a lot, you're not going to lose a lot by doing it. And maybe it will feel good to have your work out in the world. Maybe it will be successful in that platform in and of itself. Maybe you'll learn how to promote it, and that will help you sell your next book. I don't think books really flourish by being shoved into drawers and forgotten. And I do think certain books, like The Sea of Tranquility, for example, is this book that was initially self-published. And then it was found within like 8 days by a literary agent. It was really funny because of how like this underground movement just loved it. And it was really hard to classify, and it would be really hard to have published it traditionally. And because it was self-published and because it had so much love, this agent found it, and then it became this bestseller. And I don't actually love it that much, but I think it's really interesting that that's how some of like the books that were the hardest to market worked out. Like Wool by Hugh Howey, which is basically linked short stories. That was self-published initially too. And I think he had like such a good degree of success with it in a way that wouldn't have happened if he traditionally published it initially. So I don't think it's something you should eliminate. You can always do it under a pen name, although that makes it really tricky to promote. But I mean, at this point in time, I really don't think it's a mark against you as a writer. And most of like the serious poets I know and writers I know self-published at some point. So it's worth considering. But I think if someone's telling you like, to go back to what Joanne said, that the other agent said she didn't have the energy to try and sell a multi-voiced book, then I would keep looking for like comparative titles that are multi-voiced and find out who the agent is and then approach them, because maybe this wasn't a good fit for the agent because of that, because they had a bad experience in the past. But maybe an agent who had a good experience representing a multi-voice book would have a very different perspective. So that's one of the angles I would go at for you. I do think if you're not putting your energy into a new creative project and you feel like you need to get this out of your system first, you should do it in some way, whether that's getting it traditionally published or trying to, or self-publishing it. Because I really think that as writers, we feel the most fulfilled when we're writing. At least I do. I know some people who find it torturous, but I think it's pure joy. So yeah, factor that into it. How much do you like writing? Maybe it's, yeah. So things to think about. John asked the question, thanks for the advice in the Read Debut Novels Weekly. Very practical. I took that, on the Facebook page a while back, I said that it's really important to read debut novels, like the first novels by authors that are published in our contemporary culture. So not like famous debut novels by authors, but ones that are coming out now. And the reason I encouraged people to do this is you get a real sense of like the market and what's being published right now and what isn't, and what people are interested in and how they're being pitched. And like there's certain trends right now that are really obvious if you look at the debut markets. Like there's a lot of writing about race and immigration. There's a lot of writing about gender and sexual identity. There's a lot of that sort of stories. And actually science fiction, of like the speculative fiction bend, is really hot right now. And that doesn't mean that's necessarily what publishers are looking for, because that trend might already be on their way out, but that's what's actively like doing well in terms of debuts right now. But there's also still books in there from different genres and from different focuses that are getting published. And so you look through the list for those sort of things and see what's being published in terms of that, unless your manuscript already fits one of the descriptions I said before, which is a really good place to start. Anyways, so this is John's question now that I've gone back and explained the debut novel thing. So I took that advice and looked for a list of debut novels, even sought out my local librarian, but it's not easy. And the one list that I did find on the web was not very personal. The author of the list was into fantasy, YAF, and books exploring race and young adult fantasy, and books exploring race and the immigrant experience. This is partially because that's what's trending right now. I get that you need to write for a market, but my writing is a very different thematically. So do I stick to my comfort zone? As to sourcing debut works, I have begun to visit publishers' websites. So yeah, don't write for the market right now. That never really works. It's funny because when I was at Breadloaf, some of the manuscript publishers were talking about how much they wanted more memoirs, and the agents were like, no more memoir right now. Not both of them. One of them was still for it, Miriam, but the other person, the man was like, we're done. So it was really interesting to see that there is this different dynamic there. He said they had a lot of memoirs they couldn't seem to sell, even though the publisher was like, yeah, no, we need more memoirs. So I thought it was interesting, that disconnect. But anyways, sorry for that tangent. So I came up with some good sources for debut work. One is there's this really great website, and I'll post all of these online after on the chat. But one of them is called Debutiful, which is DEBUTIFUL.net. And it's a website that just focuses on debut novels. And so debut novels from all sorts of authors are on there. And then Goodreads has a really great option. If you look up Goodreads debut 2019, you can see all the books that have debuted in, but like by debut authors in 2019 that have been published, and like where they rank, for example, and like how well have they sold, that sort of stuff. So it's interesting things to learn, right? And one of the reasons I really like the Goodreads list is it isn't as trendy as the others. Like the others are looking at all the debut books and picking which ones fit the trend the best, but the Goodreads book is more, the Goodreads list is more reflecting what's actually selling, which I think is significant. There's also Read It Forward has a favorite 2019 debut novels list, which I thought was very good. And Eclectic Literature has the 20 best debuts of the second half of 2019 that was really good. And Book Riot also regularly has these sort of lists. So those are sort of things I would look into. Are there any more questions? Because now I've gone through everyone's questions for today. No? Well, I guess my one bit of personal news for the week is that I am going to AWP, which is the big writers conference in San Antonio, Texas. It moves around every year, but this year it's in San Antonio, Texas in March. So if anyone comes, is already going, I'd love to see you and meet up. But I'm excited and also a little overwhelmed. This is my second AWP and they tend to be exhausting. So, but I'm hoping I'll come back with even better advice and more new thoughts and all of that. So yeah, okay. I hope everyone has a really great rest of the week, all of one day of it, and a great weekend. Thank you for tuning in. Bye.
You missed someone's